Welcome to the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. Today we're joined by Father James Dominic Rooney, who has kindly come on the show to talk about integralism and liberalism. I believe he edited a book on such things, written about it, certainly thought about it a bunch. So to share some thoughts, here he is. Father Rooney, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jake. Happy to be here.
So, well, before we get into what on earth integralism is, or even if I'm pronouncing it correctly, tell us a little bit about yourself. I got you right before you went to Hong Kong. So, what are your areas of study? You're a priest in the Dominican order. Fill us in with a few more details.
Yeah, I am. So I'm a Dominican friar of Chicago province. I work as an assistant professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. I teach philosophy there. My areas in philosophy, my areas of specialty are really metaphysics. I do medieval philosophy, Latin and Chinese, and then I've been doing more philosophy of religion and political philosophy recently. So as you mentioned, I released that edited book with a Jesuit from Munich, Patrick Zoll, on Beyond Classical Liberalism, Freedom and the Good. But my first book was Material Objects in Confucian and Aristotelian Metaphysics. So as you can tell, I work on some hardcore stuff about how things have parts, is what I wrote that first book on. I just turned in the manuscript today, Feast of St. Maximus the Confessor, my book on hell, called Not a Hope in Hell, that's on problems in philosophy of religion associated with sin and hell. And I'll be working on a book on metaphysics, which is methodology in metaphysics. I'm hoping to have that out fairly soon. I've been sitting on it for a while when I work on the book on hell, but I'm hopefully going to get that out sometime soon. So back to more straightforward metaphysics instead of the metaphysics of philosophy of religion. So that's more or less what I've been doing. I'm also, I should say, a fellow of the Thomistic Institute in Rome and a fellow of our Center for Sino-Christian Studies.
Awesome. Well, if anybody has room on their coffee table, I mean, that's your solution. Really, any of those books should do it. Which is tougher, working with the Jesuits or the Baptists?
Oh, well, that's I'm a friend of both. I'm a fan of ecumenical dialogue. So
what a guy.
I always reach across the aisle.
Perfect. Many, many moons ago, I was a Baptist. Then I ended up Presbyterian, and now, poof, here I am, being Catholic. So yeah, you need those people reaching across the aisle. So, well, let's hit some things which we should probably set the stage with. If you want to tell us what on earth liberalism and integralism are, and then we can kind of get to comparison. You told me at the beginning of the interview something wonderful, that is the whole integralism thing is imploding, which is music to my ears. But in case I don't know, what's the opposite of imploding? It explodes again on the scene, we're going to be ready. And I definitely appreciate thinkers who have began to implode such a thing. So lay out what these two ideas are, and then let's get into it.
Yeah, I guess let me just preface things. I'm gonna give you a definition of integralism. I think integralism is easier to characterize than liberalism, because I think integralism is really a name for a kind of definite set of views. I think it's low on vague on policy proposals, but I think they have a fairly definite generic idea of what they want. I think liberalism is a bit more difficult because liberalism is a big tent, long tradition of things. And I think here's the other side of things that I just wanted to start with is, I know integralism has a kind of vested interest in saying the only alternatives are liberalism and integralism. But I just think that's stupid. Okay, so it's just false. There's no mutual exclusivity here in the sense of, it's not logically exhaustive. In fact, you could presumably be something like a liberal integralist. In fact, I think in some respects, that's exactly what some people in the tradition have been. I think Jacques Maritain actually started out as an integralist and then became what they criticize now, but his views are are relatively similar in many ways to integralism, and he accepts that integralist states are justified under some conditions. So um, I just throw that out there to say there's not actually a real serious divide here, and sometimes the integralists' own heroes, like Charles de Connick, for instance, is a famous person that many integralists cite his primacy of the common good against the personalists. Charles de Connick was not in favor of an integralist state. He was in favor of atheists having their own schools in Canada and not being forced to go to Catholic schools or support Catholic schools. So, when we turn to liberalism, then on one hand, what is liberalism? Well, I mean, the word tells us it's about liberal, it's about freedom, liberty.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of hard to say exactly which kind of liberalism we're talking about. So there's at least two, let's say, big camps. There's let's call it pre-contemporary or classical liberalism, and then there's a more modern, or then there's a more modern, what I'd call anti-perfectionist or Rawlsian liberalism. I think that's one kind of division among liberals. So in the past, what you had were like John Locke and John Stuart Mill. These kind of people had more of a view on which they were concerned about liberty. I think the thing they have in common with the modern liberals, why they'd be called liberals together, is because they thought that the state, the government, needs justification for use of coercive power. So they thought they were really opposed to views that would be like the divine right of kings, or they'd be opposed to views on which there'd be some unquestioned kind of set of governmental institutions that we have no right to object to. So the idea of these kind of views is that individual human beings have rights against their government. And for Locke and many of the classical liberals, you had different kinds of streams. So you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's worried about whether the state represents the people. He thinks that the people should be supreme. And so he's really very interested in elections and voting as representing the general will, the public will. But Locke is on like another extreme. He thinks that it's about property rights to protect you from the government, right? So the idea on his side, which is the way America went after Locke's view, was really about limiting government power in a principled way, so that the government can't exercise authority just willy-nilly, but is somehow accountable to people. And on that view, elections are important, but they're not the only thing that matters, right? So Locke and the Americans didn't think everything had to be decided by like direct democracy, right? They had representative democracy, and they had different checks on popular support. But another thing that's common in classical liberalism is the idea from people like Mill that human beings are somehow perfected by exercising their autonomy, doing what they want, doing what they I shouldn't say doing just what they want, but the idea for Mill was something like the only way we can be good people is if we really want to be good people. And the conditions under which we can really perfect ourselves like that are a political free situation, right? Where we can sort of choose our own beliefs, and we persuade people, we use persuasion, the government somehow engages in that. He thought the government could do things like that, help educate people. But essentially something like education was primary over coercion to get people to live good lives. So like that's a John Stuart Mill liberal belief. But these views kind of, you still find some of them. There's another classical view that I'm very sympathetic to, which is called today republicanism. Philip Pettit is one of the philosophers who advocates this. And what he says is, I like medieval republics. I'm a good medieval guy. The Dominicans invented all this medieval democracy business. There's a good article from an Oxford political philosopher a few years ago where he empirically showed the Dominicans spread representative democracy across Europe in the Middle Ages. But republicanism, such as these medieval communes and republics, Philip Pettit argues for this as being a distinct kind of ideal, where the idea is something like we exercise our where the opposite of being a free person is to be a slave. So what we want is we don't want the government to exercise arbitrary domination over people. And we don't want different groups in society exercising domination over each other. So we want to protect people from domination so that they can live free lives. Now, the reason I'm talking so much about that is because if you read Integralists, the only thing you're going to hear about is really a kind of twisted version of the modern integralists, the modern liberalism. So modern liberalism is mostly associated with people like John Rawls. John Rawls had a view that was anti-perfectionist. Perfectionism in political philosophy is a term for those kind of theories of government that think the point of the government is to help people live good lives, to perfect people. John Rawls was in a principled way anti-perfectionist. And so very often when people think liberalism today, they think of that anti-perfectionism. Or they think of something like this: we can't really know what's good for us, so we can't tell people what's good for them. Or it's bad for the government to have any kind of moral or religious values. They have to be neutral between all those competing comprehensive views. That's very Rawlsian. Now Rawls himself, even this is a caricature, because Rawls didn't think his view meant that there was no such thing as morality or objective moral truths, or that there was we can't know religious truth, we can't know moral truth. He didn't think any of that was true. He's not that extreme. He thought we needed to somehow limit these things in principle for like civil peace or something. We can't talk about that stuff. We can't make policy about it. Because it would cause civil war or something. So the idea among a lot of liberals that you see in Rawls, it goes back to the beginning with John Locke, and that is the idea of religious toleration. So that is a kind of core idea of the liberal tradition that it grew out of the fights between Protestants and Catholics after the Reformation, and wanted to come up with a kind of, account of not necessarily state neutrality, but at least a kind of toleration as a serious good. And let me just say, by the way, that a lot of these ideas did very seriously influence Catholics in the pre-modern period, in the pre-Vatican II times, okay? Because like toleration was considered a serious value. Some of the integralist sort of debates about integralism, people were pretty committed to the idea of toleration, and that was really a very a development that comes through liberal thought. But now to move to integralism. So what is integralism? Well,
I want to put a pin on something you said there, and that is a lot of times I hear people on, I guess, the integralists or the new right, as now some people are calling them. They like to imagine that this is basically what happened. We had this beautiful, wonderful, medieval Catholic Europe, and then liberalism seeped through, and there's no Locke, there's no anybody, it's just Roe, and he persuaded everybody that we should just not have the government do anything in support of the church, and that we should cede all power that relates to morality. And then after that, we got this flood of new ideas, many of which were bad, and maybe we had all sorts of religious turmoil thereafter. I think that's backwards. And what you said was, we had the Protestant Reformation. Now we're in states which were historically 90-something% Catholic. They're not anymore. And there's been wars, there's political problems, there's religious problems. And the question is not, do we just push a button and make everything a wonderful Catholic utopia again? The question is, do we want to keep fighting? Or do we want to find a way where we can continue to live in a peaceful civil society, and then we can have this war wage on in the world of ideas, where there's a much lower body count? So the history is not quite the way it's often presented. So I just wanted to kind of point out that big point.
Yeah, and let me say one of the things that is important in this context, I think, in terms of there's a profound history of Catholic political thought that's just getting shoved under the rug, of course. And I think obviously the presenting problem is the Reformation. And I
Hmm.
think one of the things you could press integralists on is what should we have done? Okay.
Ooh.
Because I think it's pretty obvious that the Catholic kings were not going to win. They were not
Hmm.
going to totally dominate their opponents. Integralist states were just not possible. After, in many situations. And it naturally degenerated for very good reasons. Because what happened is originally it was political compromise that we're just going to kill each other, right? And but even in that point of view, people started to realize there were serious problems here with like just killing the Protestants, right? So the St. Bartholomew's Days massacre, people like Vincent de Paul thought this was horrid, right? Francis de Sales was ashamed by it, right?
Hmm.
Um, we can't replicate those things, right? Because there's a problem here, right? It's good to have, we might say, a Catholic state. It's good to have some things like that, but other people in our countries have rights too, and we can't just pursue it immorally, right? Kill all the Protestants and set up a Catholic country. I mean, that's insane, right? Um,
Right.
Now, I point out, in fact, that the part of the political development here was also on the Catholic side far before Locke. So, in particular, the person that I point to a number of times is Robert Bellarmine, one of the famous Jesuit doctors of the Church, who, in fact, was the person who argued that there is no divine right of kings. He gave a natural law argument for popular sovereignty that I replicate in one of my papers, Illiberal Integralist Elites. I have even a footnote to Bellarmine in there where I point to his argument, and I give you a version of it. But I mean, the people in the classical tradition in the 14 and 1500s start to develop ideas in the natural law tradition that basically are floating around with liberalism, right? They're liberalism, if you want to think of it this way, the things Locke and these people are saying are really derived from that environment of Catholic natural law thinking. I mean, it's Protestant and Catholic thinking was more integrated at that time, and these views are actually variants on Catholic views. So what I mean by that is like Vittoria and many of the Dominicans who were involved at Salamanca with the conquest of the New World, discovery of the New World, and the Spanish conquest. Uh, they started to emphasize that these governments that were in the New World were legitimate, and the Spanish
Hmm.
government could not just invade and take them over under the excuse of making people Catholic, right? That was not a valid, just title to take over their governments, even though they were technically capable of doing so. They had bigger guns, etc. Um, and he has very clear limits that are enunciated about what the Spanish did was wrong. And the Dominicans happily stood on that side, right? Slavery of the Indians, even for their own spiritual good, was immoral, right? Um,
Correct.
Taking over their government, making them Catholic was immoral. So this
Hmm.
is sort of a difficulty for, if I can say again, integralists today. My friend Kevin Vallier wrote this book, All the Kingdoms of the World, and one of the problems in there is transition. How do we get from today's world to integralist utopia?
That
And
is the
I think
problem.
I think that's a very serious problem. I haven't focused on it, but he does a very good job of like, some people have said this is how we do it, but that's nuts, right? And he goes through all the steps, what you'd have to do. And his claim there is it's immoral, right, to take those steps. There would be very hard to do. And I think there's something about that, right? So let me maybe shift now to integralism because we've started to
Sure.
talk about it. So I mean, integralism itself as a term only comes out in the 19th century, and it's associated with this sort of French counter-revolutionary kind of movements. It gets very dark, though. I mean, I think people don't realize that the term actually is not so good.
Hmm.
Um, it gets associated with these people in Portugal, in Spain, who were like fascists and liked the Nazis and
Ooh.
were very anti-Semitic. And so my friend James Patterson, I think, he's very interested in the history, so he's always very concerned about this stuff because sometimes they cite these people like Joseph de Maistre or this Felix Sardina Salvani, and I mean some of them were just nasty about the Jews, right? They said all this crazy stuff like Felix Sardinia Salvani says this stuff that like liberalism is a Jewish plot to like, steal our vital fluids or whatever, like Dr. Strangelove or something. He has these weird conspiracy theories.
Wow.
I do think that integralists are not very careful about that stuff. And some people, like the integralism because of that. But the people who started it off, to go back a little bit, in the contemporary conversation, the people who started this stuff about integralism were really, I think, primarily a philosopher, Thomas Pink, and a few religious, Thomas Crean, and a layman, Alan Phimister, Edmund Waldstein. I think those people from Europe were really the people who started the modern conversation, specifically Thomas Pink. I deal with him in one of his account of integralism in one of my papers, Integralism and Justice for All at Nova et Vetera. I try to outline some of what he says and why he says it. But, integralism is a sort of view that you find before the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, people talking this way. I think the problem before Vatican II was to what extent there was, obligations to tolerate other religions. And then at Vatican II, there was this definition at Dignitatis Humanae, a declaration of the council about the right to religious freedom. Now, this was a change because prior to the council, there was lots of talk about toleration, that non-Catholics we had a moral obligation to tolerate them. Right. Okay. So that was the way people talked before the council. And that's in tension, I think, sometimes with what integralists say today. A lot of their followers that are more extreme don't care much about that. Vatican II said that no, it's not just toleration, but people have a right to religious freedom. Thomas Pink is the one who sort of started this conversation because he pointed out that the document he's sympathetic, I think, with some of the Lefebvrites, the Society of Pope Pius X, and part of their big objection to the Second Vatican Council was this Dignitatis Humanae, and because they were essentially integralists associated with the anti-revolutionary pro-monarchist movement in France. Lefebvre was, and he thought this declaration was a violation of the church's teaching, right? They had changed their teaching illegitimately somehow. And in fact, this, rather than the Latin Mass, was really central to that movement. So I think Thomas Pink wanted to sort of justify that the church didn't really change its teaching. So he pointed out in the document, it says there's a right to religious freedom, but it says this leaves unchanged the teaching of the church regarding the duties of the state toward true religion. And he interprets the document sort of like this. The document is really advancing, it's changing, it's making a development in doctrine in terms of the right of non-Catholics to have religious freedom, but it's still affirming that the ideal government is a Catholic government, and that Catholics have an obligation to establish a Catholic government. So the way I construe integralism when I was in the paper, and I try to be more specific as what is it exactly, because people give very unhelpful definitions. They talk about, right, there's a temporal and spiritual aim of the human person, and the temporal should be subordinate to the spiritual and all that kind of stuff. Well, what we're really concerned about in this view is the idea that it needs to be some sort of public subordination. It's a subordination of the governance of a state, of a country, to the governance of the church, the guidance of the church. So the way I construe integralism is actually very simple. It's that the church, the ideal political arrangement, is one in which the church can mandate the state to promote supernatural good of its citizens. So that's integralism, is the view that it's ideal political arrangement, the ideal political arrangement. So the idea is maybe there are other political arrangements that we need to compromise with in the real world, but we need to have a rational preference. We need to have some normativity to this view that the church should be able to mandate the state to pursue supernatural goods, to promote supernatural goods using coercive temporal power. right? So the sword needs to be directed by the church in some cases in pursuit of its own aims. And
Against the state? Is that the idea? So that the
not
church
a,
would have some type of coercive power against states if states don't listen to their idea about pursuing supernatural
no,
ends?
it's that the state should be subordinate to the church on this, to give its sword to the church so that the church can use it for its own
Okay,
aims, to promote its mission.
right. Okay,
So the
gotcha.
idea is something like our tax money should be able to be used by the church. Let me, not just tax money, but the idea is the civil coercive power. So the classical things that you see in the tradition, right? Like Lateran 4, you have the church commanding Christian princes to like go after heretics and confiscate their property and kill them and stuff like that, drive them out of their territory. And if they don't, those princes will be excommunicate. Um, Thomas Pink plays this up and says, how could the church have been wrong about that? So the church just has like a native right to command its princes, people who are exercising political authority within the Christian world, to do things like that, to promote its good, right? To persecute heretics or whatever the case might be. Now, integralists today, right, are sort of demure about this. What to what extent they actually want to use state power for these supernatural ends is, if I put it this way, sometimes it's being sometimes there's a political prudential aspect, but I think sometimes it's kind of play and coy. You ask some of them, and I mean sometimes they give you political programs that are like, we want to punish blasphemy, or we want to it would be better if all the Protestants were dead, and I don't think all of them believe that, but you find people who like the view for those reasons. Now, Thomas Pink and the people who are really sophisticated defenders of the view um, uh, don't think that. They don't think we should put the Protestants in prison. What Thomas Pink argues is that this view is important and necessary in order to avoid problems of religious freedom in the modern state. So what he thinks is something like this. It seems to me, based on an article he published, where he was rejecting things that Jacques Maritain proposed about religious freedom. It seems to me Thomas Pink's position is roughly this. If the church is not recognized by the state as the official religion, if the church is not like the official religion of the state, and the church doesn't have the ability to mandate the state to promote its ends, then religious freedom laws will just deteriorate and the state will persecute the church. So unless the Catholic Church is the official religion of the government, religious freedom will not be protected. So in order to prevent those kinds of violations of religious freedom, we have to like establish the church or have the state recognize it as the official religion. Now, I think this is a more reasonable position, right? It's not about going after the heretics, right? And but it's I think it's unnecessary. I mean, so basically, I argue against views like this, and I think there's kind of serious problems on a number of different levels. One of which is it just looks empirically false to me. I mean, we have problems of religious freedom in the world, but in one way, those are going to be inevitable. I mean, integralist states didn't stop that either, right? I mean, you find all the kings taking money from the church and prosecuting clerics and doing all sorts of bad stuff. So in the medieval times, right, things weren't better necessarily. In fact, things are kind of better today because, in the past, they just kill the clerics and take the church. And now it's a little bit more, we have legal recourse and we can sue the government if they try to do stuff to us. And I prefer that situation rather than, having my monastery burned down with me in it. So I think there's a sort of empirical kind of question. But I think the more deep difficulty with integralist views is that I think they're unjust to non-Catholics. So that's sort of my big thing here is I think there's a problem of what I'd call distributed justice. So what that means is we're not being fair to everybody in the country. So I think some integralists are just sort of obvious about this. So Father Thomas Crean, who's a Dominican, and Alan Phimister, I mean, are pretty obvious that what they want is to deny citizenship really to non-Catholics. Um, and uh, they think that that would be ideal, but they're willing to kind of compromise and say, well, maybe they can hold lower level political positions or have some sort of mitigated kind of citizenship. But I think that's, even though their own proposals are extreme, because they're like the go after the heretics kind of guys, right? Okay, in their integralism manual. But I think that's pretty central to the view, even for Thomas Pink, which is the idea that, like, we have to set up the government in such a way that the core of governmental power, is somehow immune to non-Catholic interference. So I think those kind of right. I mean, if we want Catholicism to be the official religion and all this stuff, they want it to have some sort of oomph to be able to mandate the government to do stuff, even when the people don't agree. I think that's kind of the view, right? Is like, I was with a group at the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and somebody presented a paper that I was commenting on. And the paper was like, we need integralism. It's really important right now because of all these things like abortion. Okay. And somebody was saying, oh, well, we don't need putting heretics in prison, but we definitely need integralism to stop abortion. And I said, well, like, why? I mean, like, how is this supposed to work? Because, I mean, why can't you do that right now? Because,
Sure.
there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution, right, that prohibits banning abortion, right? Especially after, the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade. There's no obstacle, right? I mean, there's you can go out and you can lobby in your city, in your state, to ban abortion. You can pass a federal law. You can get a constitutional referendum. So, what's the problem with the governmental system that we have? And I said, or you can move to Hong Kong. Abortion's outlawed there. We have no same-sex marriage.
Oh, wow. Good job, Hong Kong.
I think it's also the same in South Korea, right? But like, you can have a system, right? A liberal political system. Liberal political institutions can do that. So what's the problem? The response was, we tried it and it doesn't work.
So you're going to try something vastly more difficult, and then
correct, right?
to bring about the same thing that is still, by your own admission, virtually impossible. So you need two enormous political changes under your plan, where we need one. A lot of this is just so unbelievably impractical.
But I think if I can put it this way, I had two conversations, including that one, that made me kind of aware of, exemplify in my mind what's really going on. Because, I wrote this paper about the theology of integralism, undermining, I thought, Thomas Pink's theology and offering a different theological analysis. And I basically just think people don't give a shit. Right? That's not really important to integralists. I think the American integralists who are not Thomas Pink are really concerned about what I just mentioned, right? And what they're worried is I think that first thing, we tried it and didn't work. Now, what they mean is, we tried to get people to support a ban on abortion through a popular, voting, and it didn't work. So let's blow up popular voting. And I really think it's actually kind of as simple as that in terms of motivation. Because you talk to some of the people, and that's really what they want, is something like, wouldn't it be nice if the Constitution prohibited abortion and people couldn't vote it out? Well, couldn't permit it through voting, and we didn't have this debate. But I mean, that's, if I can put it this way, that's just sort of like weird and romantic, as you kind of put it. Like, there'd be two big political debates, right? We'd have to blow up the political system and start over, and then ban abortion, which in the current situation is just, if you just took over, let's imagine you just took over the Supreme Court, and they made a decision tomorrow, and they said abortion is outlawed, full stop, everywhere. You can just imagine what the reaction would be in America today. It would just, there'd be riots, fires. Doesn't matter who the president is, right? Imagine they're King Louis IX, right? And they go out on their horse and they have to kill a lot of people to restore civic order, right? It's not going to be good. And in fact, it wouldn't be stable. So I think it's just not realistic. But the second The second thing somebody told me, which I think is also really in the background of some people's minds, is that um, somebody said, well, didn't Nazi Germany kill their own people? And that made them illegitimate. And I was kind of like, well, I mean, like, they did a whole bunch of stuff originally, but I wouldn't, it's hard to say when exactly the state lost legitimacy.
Oh, really?
And they said, but isn't the state of Ohio killing all its people through abortion? I mean, millions of people. So therefore, the state of Ohio is illegitimate. We have just cause for war to overthrow the government. And I was just like, well, under Catholic doctrine about just war theory, that wouldn't be just cause for war, because we have right other kinds of recourse that we can have to stop the harm in this case.
Then you need a high probability of victory in order
You
to
need a
launch
lot
it.
of things, but I think in particular, just cause is not satisfied here, because usually for just cause we mean something like exhausting other remedies is part of just cause, right? You can't just wage a war because somebody offended your diplomats or something like that, even if what they did was wrong, because there are other ways to deal with the problem, right? Anyway, my point is something like, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I hate to. It amazes me that people say our government is illegitimate. Maybe we need to have a violent overthrow of our government, go to war with the police and sheriffs, and then the military, etc., and then hopefully win in this revolution. And revolutions almost always turn out terrible. Like, we really got lucky in the American Revolution. And nobody just says, okay, if we just scaled it back, I don't hear them taking much more reasonable things, which could also be violent. I'll give you your violent bone here, guys. And just say, at 2 a.m, bulldoze the Planned Parenthood. It's interesting that they jump from, you know what, I just don't like the way it is now. I'm really not going to go and persuade my neighbor. I'm really not going to give that much to, help out causes. We should have a violent revolution. And there is nothing in the middle, it would seem.
Well, so this is my sort of olive branch bit here. Is I'm the reason I cite those views is not because I think most integralists really believe we need violent revolution. A lot
Thank
of people
goodness.
who are really attracted to the movement, I use these views and their kind of craziness, the things they said, to sort of exemplify that I think what they're really dissatisfied with is something like they just think that we need some sort of smart guys in charge. If we had Louis IX in charge and we gave him sort of carte blanche to do what he would, then like everything be okay, and we didn't make him subject to like voting, like renewing his term of office through voting, and we didn't like have a court system to check his power, then he'd be able to think of all the good he'd be able to do.
I give you the Book of Judges.
Right.
God tried this. Give a guy a ton of power.
I think it is not coincidental that I think the movement has wound down in a little bit, because the original plan, if I want to put it this way, the plan wasn't just this crazy political theorizing. The plan, I think, originally from people like Adrian Vermeule, Patrick Deneen, and them, was that they thought by forming Catholics who could be on the Supreme Court and in the court system and in the bureaucracy of the country, we could somehow strengthen their power so that they would not be electorally accountable. And if we just put enough people in those positions who were willing to do what they needed to do based on their moral convictions, even if it was contrary to the Constitution, their religious or moral convictions, we should tell them, to kind of shut up and be quiet so they can sneak into those positions. But then we sort of form them so that they believe the Constitution doesn't really bind them. They could rule on things based on their religious or moral beliefs, even if it was contrary to the Constitution. But they should just try to twist the Constitution to fit those beliefs. That's really what they were aiming at, right? Was this sort of maybe we can kind of do something like this in the short term, and they were trying to justify that, right? That the Constitution or the popular laws, right, have no real authority over us because they're contrary to morality or contrary to the common good. So the idea, I think, was really something like, if I'm a Supreme Court justice, or if I'm I'm in some other legal situation, and there's a law that says abortion is permitted in my state, I have no obligation to follow what the law says. I don't have to rule in keeping with precedent or the laws. Um, and I think there's obviously a kind of conflict there for a Catholic judge,
Mhm.
but I don't think it just licenses us to say the Constitution has no authority. Right, under the Roe versus Wade situation, let's say, or the contemporary situation with Obergefell and Hobbes, right, with the Hodges with the same-sex marriage situation. I mean, I don't think a Catholic judge, I think they have a kind of problem of conscience. How they rule is important in this case. But I don't think they should just say the Constitution, the precedents have no authority over us, so we should just rule, in line with morality in this case. Or, because we think same-sex marriage is morally illegitimate, we just shouldn't acknowledge it. I think, you could recuse yourself, right? If you have serious worries about ruling in keeping with the law. But I mean, I tend to think that, if I can put it this way, I mean, the judge's job is not so much to figure out whether they think the Constitution is legitimate or not, but to rule in keeping with it according to the rules that have been introduced. So I like to think Aquinas has a case that I think is important when he talks about legal justice and what judges do. And he says, if the judge learns somebody is innocent or somebody is guilty outside of the courtroom, the criminal who's the defendant is actually innocent or is actually guilty, and they're going to be convicted or they're going to be released even though they're not, they're going to be acquitted even though they're guilty. Can the judge just intervene and make a verdict contrary to the evidence? And he says, well, that's unjust, because there are certain kinds of procedures for introducing evidence and things. And so the judge might know as a private person that this person is innocent, but he has to rule in keeping with the evidence that's been introduced. I think that shows you there are moral obligations to being a judge, right? That you have to follow the constraints that are imposed on you as part of your duty. And you can't rule on the basis of private knowledge. There are cases where, like, our moral knowledge comes in and it's important, but I think here's the basic thing, right? Our system is set up so that there's a division of powers and a division of duties. So it is true that the judges have to rule in keeping with the law, but that doesn't mean the law is like sacrosanct and we can't change it. It means if the judge wants to change the law, he's not the person who can change it by himself, right? He has to go to the court, go to the legislature, and get them to vote it down, right? Or his job in our system, like with the Supreme Court, is constitutional review, among other things. So he can say whether the law is contrary to the Constitution, but he can't just strike it down because he thinks it's immoral, right? So it seems to me that this just sort of misses certain kinds of important things.
To clarify a little bit here, what we're not saying is that a judge has license to sin because they're doing their job. What we're saying instead is that there is something that would be great. Let's say the banning of abortion. We would love to ban it. However, not every good thing that is within your power is licit for you to actually carry out. So it's true that, say, a police officer could see, I don't know, a terrible criminal who they know is just like super evil and he's jumping over a fence. And he's a crazy wild psychopath. He could just draw and kill him right there. And that might be good for society if he's a wild psychopath. However, you can't just draw and fire and do that. You would actually bring them before the court, etc. So he's not sinning by not shooting, and the judge is not sinning by not taking this action. We're not saying that you can sin in your duty. Now, on the flip side, if it was a judge or a police officer who is being told by the law to do something which was intrinsically evil, I think we're on the same page where we say, sorry, unjust law is no law at all at this point. And you are not under that whatsoever.
I said under those circumstances, you sort of refuse to cooperate, right? But I think for a judge, that means something like recusing yourself, right? I mean, So my point is something like, to get back to it, right? I mean, I think you're right that the moral intuition, the reason integralism became popular, I think, within the American political scene, is like the Dirty Harry case you gave, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
like, and this is, I think, the emphasis on the common good. So many of the integralists always talk about the common good as being the supreme, right, principle, that we should act in the interest of society. But it's pretty false that the common good, just the fact of whatever does in fact contribute to the common good, uh, you don't have a right to do anything that promotes the common good, right? Because sometimes doing it, you
Right.
can do it in a way that's immoral, like you just
Mm-hmm.
said with the Dirty Harry case, right? So it might in fact contribute to the common good, but that doesn't mean it's right to do. It's good that we promote the common good, but it's also good that it's part of, in fact, this is one of the things I pointed out, it's part of the common good that we follow justice, right? Because that's part of the common good of society, is not just like a consequentialist promoting of money, or of promoting moral following of the rules, or how many people go to mass, or how many Catholics there are. These are all good things, and we should promote them. But part of the good of society is, in fact, the good of justice and fairness,
Mm-hmm.
and like people getting fair trials, even when the trials don't result in the correct verdict, right? I mean, we think that the fair trial is important. Um, so I think you don't have to be a liberal to say those things. So I'll just highlight that, right? When I said right at the beginning, integralists like to say, if you're not with us, you're against us, you're a liberal. And I mean, one of the things I've pointed out, again, in this illiberal integralist elites, is in fact that the natural law tradition is in contradiction with integralism. So the way integralists think of what gives you right to do things is because it promotes the common good. But in fact, the natural law tradition rejects that, right? It says that there are constraints from considerations of justice in that. So this is precisely the point of that famous paper, The Primacy of the Common Good by Charles de Connick, is that the common good is non-aggregative. It's not just, right, the promoting the sum total of things that are good for us. It's also
Mm-hmm.
about, right, something like civic friendship or civic trust and justice, right? Those are goods that are not reducible to just the individual goods that we'd be considering promoting. So it's really, the natural law tradition classically is also in favor of popular sovereignty. As I mentioned, it was against the divine right of kings with Bellarmine and Vittoria. And the integralists seem to reject that in principle. Um, and I think that's difficult. I don't understand. As I said, I've argued that this view is, I think, unjust and contrary to many important things in Catholic political thinking and tradition. And so that was why I got worried about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, the divine right of kings is interesting. I was doing a series on the Book of Judges, and one of the phrases which comes up a number of times, which is quite interesting, is "for God and for Gideon." And
Hmm.
this is like yelled out at one point where it's Abimelech who's ruling. And it's like, well, what an interesting thing, because you could imagine somebody saying, well, divine right of kings, Abimelech is now king. But it's like, no, he took it just by violence, by killing all of Gideon's brothers. Like, it's not necessarily fair. And you could hear someone say, well, it's divine right of kings because isn't Abimelech the half brother, so he is legitimately in the line of the kingship, right? So he's legitimate. Well, no, scripture seems to reject that also. So it's not just hereditary, it's not might makes right. Instead, what's offered as an alternative is the for God and for Gideon. And that's repeated in a few ways. And then there's times where Gideon doesn't act in accord with God. And then you can act out of accord with Gideon. So, with like natural law, for instance, if a government comes and says, you can't kill each other, guys, and you can't steal each other's stuff, this is a God and Gideon moment where when they're standing in line with God's commands, then there is no distinction. To listen to the government is to listen to God because they're speaking with one voice. Not because God lined up with the king, but because the king lined up with God, at which point there is this divine right. Um,
Yeah, I'd point out two things. I agree with what you're saying. I think it's important to point out the monarchy actually in the Old Testament is not right what God wants for Israel, right? The,
Mm-hmm.
the the you have the judges, and as you mentioned, they're non-hereditary. The hereditary kingship and all that is sort of a secondary follow-up plan. Thomas
Right?
Aquinas points this out, by the way, in the Summa. He says the original plan of God for the government of Israel is a mixed government, a republic kind of situation. That's how he interprets the Mosaic law and the government that it outlines. In keeping with Aristotle, he says it's a mixed government. It's not a
Well, a lot of
monarchy or, you
the
know,
founding fathers pick up on that. They go, wait a minute, we had Moses, the executive branch. We had Jethro come in and set up a system of judges. And then we also have the elders of Israel who actually join in the authority of Moses by going on Mount Sinai with him to receive the law with him for the people. So these are three different branches. And then this group of elders is what is known as later the Sanhedrin, the 70 plus one. So you typically have the one leader, like Moses guy, then you have this. So yes, that was plan
I
A.
just I just pointed out that was if you look at what's in the in the Summa, Aquinas has an interpretation like that. But the other thing I'd say is it is kind of perverse. If you're thinking of the natural law tradition, you find in this Crean and Phimister manual, they defend a kind of vision of the divine right of kings, which is contrary to the natural law tradition. So let me just say though at the end here. Um, in this paper I wrote on integralism and justice for all, I don't think either that the government needs to be just a pure, you might say, a pure natural law kind of government. So I point out, I think there are confessional Catholic governments now. I mean, Poland is one of them. Uh, you can have a confessional constitutional Catholic regime and have some preference for it without
Sure.
being integralist.
Like,
So this is by the way what Jacques Maritain said at certain points, or at least it's a sort of view that would fit things he said.
and that's in the
I don't
document
think
on religious freedom, is that it permits those type of states.
correct, and it gives guidelines as to how they should go. So my interpretation or how I respond is, well, we can have an ideal political arrangement in which there's a Catholic confessional state. Maybe that's good, right? Maybe it is in fact good for our country to confess the Catholic religion. I think it is, right? I mean, I think we have, in an ideal situation, if people support it, if there's good reasons for it, in terms of, there'd be good reasons to put it in our Constitution that we recognize the Catholic religion, we recognize God, etc. But there's a distinction between that and the integralist position on which the political arrangement should be one in which the church can mandate the state to promote supernatural goods. So you can still think, well, maybe the state can support the church in various ways. I mean, the US government, the Polish government, the German government, the British government, the Irish government give money to the Catholic Church, right?
Mm-hmm.
For different projects, right? I mean, they have different rules on how they do that, how they apportion the money, how they take it. But I mean, there's lots of ways in which the church can collaborate with the government can support the church without having an integralist state, right? You could have
Right.
a constitutional regime where you decide you're going to have like Germany, you're going to have a church tax, and you can opt out of it or you can send it to your church of choice, right? But I mean, like there's nothing in principle. These are like Germany's a liberal democratic state, right? I mean, Poland is even a confessional kind of liberal democratic state. It has Catholicism in the Constitution. The Irish Constitution starts in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost.
Oh, nice.
I think these are things that we should point out to say, to say I want a government that is not integralist, or that I think there's a problem with integralism, is not even to say in the past integralist states were always wrong. It's just to say something like integralism is the view that this is the ideal political arrangement. And in our world, it is not the ideal political arrangement.
In our world, 100%.
There's better ways to protect religious freedom and even like to have a confessional Catholic state. We can have them today. I mean, they exist. And we got to adapt to some of the situation. And Maritain, I thought, had a good position with John Courtney Murray. Both of them had I think, a very reasonable thing, which is they didn't deny that the integralist states could have been justified in the Middle Ages because it was very solidly Catholic and all that. But they said, well, here's the thing we deny. There's no ideal political arrangement. It depends on the situation and the scenario and like the setting of the people. And they said, well, there are principles for church-state freedom, collaboration, the duties of the state to the church. But how they function in each age is really different. And Charles Journet, who was one of the people at Vatican II who helped really, I think, craft Dignitatis Humanae, was a good friend of Maritain. I mean, this was the ideal in his. This is how he argued for the view on the floor of the Second Vatican Council was by appealing to these ideas. And I think the church does have a critical role in contemporary society by advocating for. Today we're not so worried about a government persecuting the church if they're not Catholic. We're worried about countries that avoid subscribing to religious freedom laws, right? Or giving effect to religious freedom. So the church's role these days is quite similar in many ways to its role in the Middle Ages and its indirect power over the state, which is it's trying to affirm there are moral and spiritual limits to state power, and that states really are illegitimate if they don't observe those kind of robust protections of religious freedom. So that's what the church says when it goes to the United Nations. That's what the popes have said, from John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis, is that's the church's role in the modern world, is to be a voice, advocating for those constitutions that have religious freedom protections. And I think that's something we can see as a clear role for the church today. You might say its role has shifted, but the principles are still there, right? It's the same principles as in the Middle Ages, ultimately, but we've just shifted the mode of advocacy and the way that we deal with it today. And I think the way we do it today makes sense, right? We have a pluralistic society. You can't just, blow up the U.S. government and install an integralist one. It's just not going to work. It's going to lead to all sorts of problems. So, I mean, it looks to me like a kind of a pipe dream, and it doesn't seem to get us anything. I mean, it might just sort of rev up these kind of bad thoughts, about the sort of things I mentioned, the Dirty Harry scenarios. And that's where I wonder if the moral intuitions are broken on this view very deeply. But, I mean, I'm not opposed to Catholic government. I'm not opposed to Christianizing society. I think, yeah, we can do that. But again, like my conversation with that person, why can't we do it now? I mean, you can go out and do it right now. So that's what I think we should do.
Yeah, I agree. People are only focusing on the government, not focusing on the people. And
Correct.
if we had the people 100%, 99%, whatever percent Catholic, then sure, great. Yeah, let's have a Catholic government, because I think that would be good in general for the country, which apparently is Catholic now. But if it's not, then we actually need to, as a government, back down our laws to accommodate the people. And people go, what? Are you kidding me? No, we should use force and violence and coercion and stuff, and we should just remove them morally. It's like, we do have an example in Scripture of the lawgiver par excellence, Moses himself, backing off of the divorce law, saying this is too hard for you guys to follow. So he says, okay, you can write a permission of divorce. And a lot of the tradition in the Jewish tradition said that was because their hearts were so hard, they would kill their wives otherwise. So they wanted to get out, and it's either they're going to kill this woman, or you allow her to go safely and say, hey, I have been divorced here because I was kicked out of my home, not because I necessarily did something, and now they're free to go. So Moses, I mean, the integralists, I'd imagine there were some proto ones there saying, come on, Moses, toe the line, buddy. Like, this is the law that we got from God, which was for this people. Do we not have a natural and supernatural end? Are we not the chosen people set apart for this kind of thing? You can imagine that voice, but it turns out the right thing to do in that situation, prior to the new covenant infusion of grace, which makes a higher order law possible, at that point in history, he was checked in his power to bring people to a better end by the state of people. And that was the right move, because sometimes you have to move people slowly in virtue.
Yeah. I would say, in defense of integralism on that point, I think, not all of them, as I said, are moral maximalists who think we've just got to enforce everything, and uh, I, I think that integralism wouldn't be wrong just because of the fact that we shouldn't try to enforce all morality. So, I mean, Aquinas and people agree, right? The government can't enforce all morality. That's not feasible. It's not within their remit ultimately, because they have their primary duties toward public justice, public morality in a certain way. So they can't enforce everything. And as you say, it might be bad that way. The law would lose legitimacy and authority. But I do think that there's the deeper issue, I think, which is really what gets to the heart of integralism, what I think the problem with it is something like, there are non-Catholics in our midst. They've lived here for a long time, and they have a right, to be treated as citizens. And there's a sort of problem with sort of excluding them, with treating them as if they don't have those rights, to be part of our government, to have a say in what we decide. And I think it's that kind of thing that's really the sort of worrisome bit.
At which point, I just want to, get out my St. Augustine hand and be like,
yeah.
guys, you have citizenship in 2 states, right? We have the city of man and the city of God. So you are trying to deny them citizenship in both. No.
Well, yeah, it's sort of, that's precisely the point of integration here, right? But you might think that's a difficulty, because I think even just looking at the integralist states historically, this is something I've raised with like Father Waldstein, is because it looks pretty empirically the case that integralist states were pretty nasty to non-Catholics, specifically Jews. I mean, like, that's sort of the dark shame of this history, is that they're very hot on these Catholic monarchies of the past, like Louis IX, Andrew Willard Jones. I'm reading his book on this. But I mean, it's not, the things that happened to the Jews in those regimes are pretty nasty, pretty horrible, what they did. And you ask, well, why will your regime not do the same thing? And it seems to me they don't have a good answer on those questions, and that's part of what worries me. I mean, that's how this whole thing started, is I kind of got in an exchange on Twitter with these people about precisely that question, and I mean, I think it's troubling that they don't have a good response. Now, I think Thomas Pink is more sane on some of these questions. But as I said, you can read my article about that. But I think some of them could learn a thing or two from him, because I think he's really the sanest or most aware of Catholic teaching on these questions. And so he actually thinks that's part of what, Dignitatis Humanae did involve a development, that we need to protect those people. But this creates, if you really think about what Thomas Pink's kind of integralism would look like, it looks to me very unstable. And I've actually, me, Kevin Vallier, and Thomas Pink had a conversation about some of this, but I think he's not on board with some of what the American integralists want. I just encourage, if you're interested in Catholic teaching on this, I mean, I don't think you should be an integralist, but if you're an integralist and you want the good view, you read him, or you want the best kind of view, you should read what he says. And then you read me to figure out why I think there's a problem with the view. But I call him in my paper a sophisticated integralist. His views are sophisticated, and he's aware of Catholic teaching on these things, where I think a lot of people are, as I said, I think they're not really interested in the theology, in the Catholic teaching bit. They're really interested in a political project. And that's what I focused on in our conversation today. I just want to make that clear. There's lots of nuance in the theology, and we could get into the difficulties of dealing with the theological points. But I think at the end of the day, most people are really interested in it for political reasons that we've discussed. They're not really interested in the theology. A lot of them are like, I talk to some of these crazy people on Twitter, and the integralist sympathizers are like, Iran is great, we want to be like the PRC, and if only the PRC were Catholic, that's the government we want. I think you even find among some of the mainstream American integralists like Adrian Vermeule and them, you do see them uh, have lots of sympathy toward like the Chinese government. And I think it's really a sort of political thing that's really about that. It's
Right.
not so much about the theology. You don't see in, for example, Vermeule's Common Good Constitutionalism. I mean, theology doesn't come up very directly. So I think the theology is not so important to some of these questions. I think it's really a political question. But I think now part of the reason I think integralism has lost its steam is because there's not much prospect anymore for some of the things they wanted. I mean, I think they have some juice perhaps with J.D. Vance because he likes their views, from what I understand. But I mean, I think they've sort of morphed. I mean, Sohrab Ahmari was very sympathetic with them and Deneen. But as far as I can tell, I'm not, real plugged into all the politics and all their views and how it changes over time. But my impression is they're sort of broadly socialist, and that's sort of the thing they're really concerned about. Is they're concerned about this sort of, communitarians. They're worried about free market economics as undermining morality or conservative values, social values.
There's a
They
lot
want
of
to
that
sort of
out there.
pass kind of moralizing kind of laws. And it's in many ways kind of vague now, what the connection is with the theology. But I think the more they try to give a concrete policy option to it, I think Sohrab has gotten less, he's gotten more moderate or something. He's on a different wavelength these days. But I think the rest of them are just, the concrete policy options are not real clear. And when they are clear, they offend people and they can't get any support for their views, or they make people angry, or it becomes obvious that they're not very politically serious about things. So, I mean, I think that's why their view is kind of imploded. So, but I do think at the end of the day, we do have a good kind of moral learning from this. What's the learning for Catholics, good pious Catholics? Well, I mean, I think for us Catholics who want to be involved in politics, do something good for the country, there's lots we can do right now within the system as it currently exists. And I think we have our work cut out for us to Christianize society.
Mm-hmm.
Does involve changing the social structure.
Sure.
It involves thinking about how we can craft these laws. I think in particular, I think we're just avoiding the big questions, which are the things that really are scaring people, the things that are generating a lot of polarization are going to be the things like abortion and same-sex marriage for Catholics. We're not doing a good job persuading people. And we're fantasizing about blowing up the government to do this, but like it seems to me we need to figure out how to persuade people. I mean, because we have this free field to do it ultimately, and we're not doing it. We're not doing it effectively. And I'll just point out, like, the overturning of Roe versus Wade wasn't accomplished by integralists. It was accomplished by precisely long-time persuasion and building up a coalition of these people, like the natural law people, right? In politics, like Robert George and John Finnis, and the people that came out of that new natural law movement had an influence, especially with originalism in law. I mean, originalism as a legal movement basically won, and it was part of what led to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And it was an alliance of people from different views that managed to get together around something that wasn't against abortion specifically exactly, but also, I mean, we did manage to build up with like the Project Rachel and the Crisis Pregnancy and the Pro-Life March. I mean, there really was a good public case that started to persuade people and change people's opinions about abortion, which is why it was successful as a movement. But it sort of after they won, after they overturned Roe versus Wade, now they're lost. They're kind of divided against themselves now, the pro-life movement, and it's unclear what's going to happen next. And I think in particular, the Republican Party changing its platform has now made that, Catholic and Christian cooperation with the Republican Party much more morally diffident on some of these questions. And I think that's the task for us today, is to figure out what to do next. And I think, if I can put it this way, integralism just strikes me as a waste of time. It's a kind of fantasy thing, but like the things we need to focus on are really changing people's hearts and minds and building coalitions with people that don't agree with us, who are not already Catholic. I mean, those are the people we need to really work with and figure out how to, because there are people that agree with us on these issues, right? It's not just Catholics. Right. It's not just tratty Catholics who have berets and cigars. It's normal human beings out in the world who do find like some of the stuff with the transgender movement, there are worrisome things about the kind of question how they're influencing our society and changing our laws and political structures. Even if you're sympathetic, of course, I'm very sympathetic with transgender people, but I worry, and I think a lot of people are getting scared about some of these sort of progressive political movements that seem very radical. And I can understand that people are scared and are going to integralism because it's like an equally radical kind of shift. But I mean, it seems to me that the task lies elsewhere. The task is really, it's hard, but it's like, think through, how can we take the wind out of the sails? How can we express that we want, for instance, in Hong Kong, we're having a big debate about legalizing same-sex marriage because Taiwan did it. And there's very legitimate concerns, I think, about the oppression of gay people and same-sex partners, because there's very difficult legal questions about what to do if somebody's married in another country and comes to yours, and then they how to deal with it. But I mean, also just sort of there's real political persecution of gay people in some places, and people getting beat up and stuff, and
thrown off roofs is a common punishment in much of the Middle East.
And it's not just the Middle East. It's also like some people don't want them to politically organize in any way, and anyway, I find there to be a lot that's there's quite legitimate concerns about fairness. That even, I mean, the Pope has said things about this, about civil unions and that. I'm not endorsing anything in particular. I'm just saying, like, the way to deal with it is you need to recognize there's legitimate claims to fairness that don't have anything to do with the moral question. And we need to have good thinking about, like, actually what kind of policy options can we have that would help navigate this. Because if we just say no and say, we're going to throw them off the roofs, no one's going to take us seriously. So, right. And I mean, it's just not going to work, right? For lots of different reasons. It's going to be immoral, right? There's legitimate concerns here. So I'd say the same thing with this transgender kind of concerns. As I said, I'm very sympathetic with it. I talk in my class, I teach human rights at Hong Kong Baptist, by the way. Like every year we have a MA program in human rights. I'm one of the people who teaches human rights to the undergrads. That's why I'm interested in this, is because I think it's there's serious questions about, like, how we fairly treat people in this without giving up my moral convictions. So that's sort of the problem I have, is like, well, of course, I'm sympathetic with people who are in this situation. I don't morally agree with what's going on necessarily, but like, how do I deal with it politically? I don't want to get involved in what we call formal or remote material, proximate material cooperation with things I think are wrong. I don't want to, limit religious freedom on this, but it's a hard question, and it seems to me it's just distracting to go to these other things. This integralist political theory just strikes me as sort of avoiding the problems. So anyway, that's what I try to do, is try to think through them.
Gotcha. Well, what we're saying is we got to persuade people. We need to change people's minds, change people's hearts. We need to, yes, get involved in politics. Pope Francis recently said it's good for Catholics to do exactly that. We ought to. We can live our Catholic faith in the role that we have, right? So if we're a legislator, we can, sure, put up good Catholic legislation. Wonderful. If you're a judge, judge fairly. um, but if the integralists did what they want without first doing what we want, I think it could catastrophically backfire. If you imagine that a minority was able to form a state with all of the abilities that they wish to have, including the persecution of heretics to whatever level of violence is the level of violence du jour, they're able to push certain creeds, declare some things blasphemous and off the table entirely. If they're the minority and they get that done, it's just wait until the majority then takes the reins, because that's an incredibly unstable political situation. There are few times in history where a minority with a very different view does hold power for an extended period of time against the will of the vast majority of people. But it's rare, for one, and two, it's really only possible with an incredible concentration of wealth and power, which we do not have. So in our situation, I'd say you're simply just like loading the political gun and just putting it right on the table. And there's a lot more hands than yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the difficulty with things like just to throw it out there. I mean, that's sort of the difficulty with a lot of even the proposals that are much more moderate. I mean, I think Vermeule's proposals are moderate. He doesn't want to put Protestants in prison, as far as I know, or do any of this crazy hyper-violent stuff, you know. But I mean, I think the difficulty is exactly what you're saying, which is, yeah, I mean, if you decide that we can just kind of co-opt the systems of power and do what we want and stop following the kind of rules, you know, of the U.S. government, the U.S. constitutional system, we can just do it, you know, as long as we capture the state, we can do what we want. Well, I mean, that's exactly what you said. It's especially right now with all the division, right? It's putting the loaded political gun on the table, and there's a lot of other people out there. You know, if you read, you've probably seen, I'm sure a lot of listeners have seen Man for All Seasons. I mean, that's exactly the point, right at the beginning with I think his name's Rupert, right, the young man, and Thomas More says something like, you know, you just want to knock down the laws of the land, but then such a great wind will blow. Where will you hide when the devil comes to find you? Right? I mean, you think knocking down the laws is a good thing because it'll make things more efficient in pursuit of the good, but it also just, you know, take all the guardrails off, right? Take all the stops out, right? And it's not going to end well for Catholics, because the trad Catholics in them are a serious minority, right? Even among Catholics, faithful Catholics to the teaching of the church on all these issues is pretty relatively a minority, even these days when we're doing a bit better. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take the guardrails off. I think the guardrails have good purposes for our political life. I think they're part of the common good. So,
well, to wrap up a little bit on the common good theme, freedom. That's something which I'd say is a core aspect of liberalism. Certainly, there's a lot of disagreement which freedoms ought to be there, but it does seem to me that when God created the universe, he decided to include freedom. He decided to include the option to abuse our freedom or the option to pursue him. So he seems to be a fan of freedom. And furthermore, we seem to be creatures whose natural environment is freedom. I mean, if you look closely at a fish, you can discover this thing lives in water. I think if you look closely enough at the human person, you'll discover this good follower, or this good lover and truth-following creature has to exist in some type of free life so that they can pursue the good and learn to follow truth. And I'm sure fishes run into rocks, you know, birds fly into windows, and humans, well, I don't know, they send themselves towards hell. But freedom is nevertheless something which God gave us, and on purpose, and ought not always or so simply be foreclosed by the state. So I want to hear your thoughts a bit on what's the role of freedom in the state? When's it good?
Yeah.
maybe what's a limit? I know that could be an entire other book or podcast.
Yeah, I'll just I'll try to be rather brief. So I think of course we have different there's a famous Serveus Pinckaers drew this famous freedom of indifference versus freedom for excellence, which is sometimes a different kind of category that's kind of similar that people have brought up as negative freedom versus positive freedom. Um, so the idea of freedom of indifference or negative freedom is freedom from constraint, freedom from coercion, freedom from domination, whereas freedom for excellence or positive freedom is freedom to self-perfect or to pursue something that is good. And I do think we were talking before we got started here about my book on hell, where I think there's an interesting set of theoretical commitments that are common to sort of people who like integralism and to people who are in favor of universalism, which is something like freedom ain't all that great. Because if you can resist God and end up in hell, who cares about that? God shouldn't care about that, right? He shouldn't think it's valuable. And it is right to say freedom, when it's abused, the freedom that is abused is not a valuable use of your freedom. But that doesn't mean that the persons that have the freedom are not valuable anymore, or that right. So here's two things I'd say. The first is it's quite true that our freedom is primarily consisting in precisely that power for excellence. So when we talk about the virtue of prudence, right? You don't need to make a mistake to develop prudence. You need experience, right? But there's no reason our moral development needs to involve sin. It does for many of us, right? That's just part of the human condition after original sin. But I mean, Mary and Jesus grew in grace and wisdom and prudence over time, but involved no kind of sinfulness, right? And there's something important to say there, which is true freedom and forming your own opinions and acting freely. It does involve not acting under the domination of someone else, but it's supposed to be a freedom for excellence. Now, on the other side of things, I think this is where I'd say on the other side, for us in our human society, and even the way you might say God sets things up, domination is sometimes a bad circumstance under which to develop those virtues. If other people tell you what to do, you're never going to think for yourself, right? Is a kind of simple way to put it. But I'd put it the other way too, which is most of the concern I'd have for political freedom and why political freedom is good is not so much, you might say, directly the value of freedom. What I think it has to do is the possibility of misusing our freedom. So a lot of people are worried about me misusing my freedom, right? And that's why I need the government to stop me. But I think we've discovered very, very empirically that the problem is nobody is free of that problem, most particularly the people in government. So what I would like is rather to set up a system where everybody's freedoms are constrained, where we recognize that we need to not dominate other people because it easily opens us to lots of problems, right? It easily opens us to abuses of power. I mean, I think it's actually just as much true within the church as without. And I think we're very much learning that these days, that autocracy in the church and keeping people unaccountable, people thought, well, that was a great thing because these church people are really, like great, and they're supposed to be leading us spiritually. I'm in right now, I'm in my hometown, Toledo, Ohio. We had some of the first sex abuse cases, right? And I was in Washington, D.C. with Cardinal McCarrick when he was there. And, some people in the church being unaccountable to other people is not good, right? There's a reason the Catholic Church invented this thing called canon law. And I think it's a great thing because that's what it does, is it makes us clerics are governed by law. There's rule of law. So the bishops are not independent and can't just do whatever they want. They're constrained by law. Nobody is in this autocracy mode. I think even I'm Byzantine Catholic, by the way, so I have very strong, intuitions that at Vatican II, I think was very prominent. That even the Pope isn't a sole magic agent, right? Who's like, he's not the Führer of the Catholic Church. He is accountable to the laws of God and to a certain extent the laws of the Church, right? There's things in our tradition that he can't like change, right? Vatican I made a definition. The Pope can't wake up tomorrow and say, I define that Vatican I was wrong. There are constraints on his authority because we're governed by law and reason. That's what God set up the world to do. That's what freedom comes from, is from following what's good and reason, right? The goal for human beings is to operate through the kingdom of God, through their own, right, reason, their own decision making. That's what God wants for each of us, and that's supposed to be the freedom of the church. So I'll just throw that out there. When we're talking about what true freedom looks like, it's very important to remember St. Thomas Aquinas, good man, right? Okay, I like to cite him a lot. He said the domination is an effective original sin. You find in Augustine the same idea, that slavery and the political authority that comes through domination, including of man over woman, by the way, patriarchy and all that sort of stuff, is an effective original sin. It's not what God intended for us. But Aquinas says political authority is not an effective original sin because there are different ways of exercising political authority. He says, here's the kingdom of God. We will be free citizens who follow what God says and God's directions because we want to. That's the kingdom of God, is because we will be following what God says because we love him, because we love the truth, we love justice. And I'll tell you what, even within the liberal tradition, that's sort of like, that's something I don't disagree with. Like if you see in Rawls, he wants agreement for moral reasons. He wants people to follow the law because it's right. And I think that's obviously the right answer, right? That's what the natural law tradition has always said. We want people to follow the law, to obey the government, because they understand that it is right and good for them to do so. It's good for other people. It's part of their duties of charity and love of other people in society. So I'll just throw that out there and say, by the way, you should read my good friend Kevin Vallier's book, All the Kingdoms of the World. He has some other good political philosophy that's at a much higher level. But I mean, he's a liberal. I'm not a liberal. He's a liberal. And some of his other work, he has a book, Must Politics Be War? He really underlines the idea that that's why he thinks liberalism's a good idea, because he thinks it's really this emphasis on charity and freedom. As I said, I'm not sympathetic with that, but he does a very good job, I think, in All the Kingdoms of the World, underlining some other things about why this integralist ideal is not so good. And he doesn't appeal to his liberalism to do it. He's trying to be sympathetic to them and not employ any views they disagree with. But if you're interested in some of those views of freedom, I think he's a good guy to think through with.
Gotcha. Well, let me throw in one more thing, and then I'll pass it to you to kind of wrap it on up. There's a section in the Gospels where Jesus says, I no longer call you slaves or servants, but friends. And I think that's really the dichotomy here. And you think, we just covered in another podcast a section where Aristotle very unpopularly says that a slave is the tool of the master. So he's like a living tool. It's like, well, in what respect is that? Because he's just mean to others? No, what he's saying is that either you're directed by yourself or you're directed by another. And if you're directed by another, well, then you don't have that internally. So that's the sense that we have this slavery thing. And then friendship is, well, we gather around goods which we mutually recognize as good. We're bound together in mutual appreciation of things that we can love and love together. Okay, and then later Aristotle talks about how that is actually what makes coercive power in the state no longer necessary, is friendship. So these are the two sides I see, slavery and friendship. And the importance to me of freedom is, what pop quiz, you'll get it right. What part of Christ's life was saving? All of it. right? So the entire life was saving. So we have to ask, all right, if we're to emulate Christ and live a holy life, we have to offer to God, like he did, a whole human life. So if we are slaves, if we are not being directed by ourselves in response to the goods, but always through another, then we're actually deficient in our ability to emulate Christ and offering the whole human life. Now, this could be preferable to offering like a super evil human life, right? Like if everything you want to do is always evil, and somebody says, I'm sorry, man, I know you want to be directed yourself. You're going to have to be directed through another. And now I'm going to point you to better ends. That would be like prison, right? We're going to have to direct you to something else. You're now directed to another. But that's actually a tragedy. What we want instead is friendship, self-directed people acting out of love regarding the goodness of others and ultimately of God. And that means that political authority is not just a tool of domination, but it's a way to actually work together for the common good in a way that mutually respects one another's freedoms. I'll kick it back to you for the last word.
I have great agreement with everything you said. I maybe end this way. I think it's important to underline, as you said, civic friendship. As I mentioned, my friend Kevin Vallier, he likes to talk about that too. Civic trust, civic friendship is sort of the goal. I agree wholeheartedly. Let me say, though, I'm very kind of Augustinian and Thomistic in my politics. And I think one of the things that's important to underline here at the end is these claims support, my area of agreement with the integralists, which is the church has a very important role to play in that, which is we can't do that by ourselves. Our natural means are going to be insufficient. Natural political means are going to be insufficient to make people friends. It requires justification. It requires the work of the Holy Spirit. And I think this is actually, by the way, this is the next book project, after some of these other things get done, is going to be work on political theology. And it's precisely this idea that I think the state is insufficient to achieve its aims. The sorts of aims it gets from natural law, that everyone recognizes that the point of the state is to promote these kinds of peace, civic peace, friendship among people. This is going to require something more potent than what the state can give. And I think
100%.
my kind of so I think the best things Catholics can do, to be quite honest, I'm very maybe I'm an integralist on some of this, is baptize the politicians and send them to good Catholic schools and form them to be upstanding human beings. I think that's actually one of the best ways we can affect our political governance, is to make sure that we form our kids well and keep them in the church. I think a lot of these governments throughout the world that are oppressing people, I mean, I tell you what, I pray for them, their leaders, every day. I wish they'd convert to Christianity and find the truth, and it would hopefully change their hearts. I think that's the sort of thing we should aim at as Catholics, and I think it has had effects in human history. It's been a good effect on the world. It's achievable, and I'd say at the end that this mission that we have to convert the world to Christianity, to Christianize society, that's part of our faith too. Is that I think it's dangerous to think like this, that the church can't do its job unless it has the government supporting it. Well, the church did its job pretty well when the government was killing us, and still is throughout the world. And it's nice if the state is supporting us. It's good for them. They're not doing things that are immoral, right? If they're not persecuting us and killing us and taking away our freedoms, they're doing something good. But Christ didn't give us political power as a church. When he sent us into the world to convert the world, he gave us spiritual tools. He gave us, the Dominican order. We've gotten into problems with collaborating with the state in the past, with the Inquisition. But our mission when we were sent by St. Dominic was to use the word and to convert people through reasoning. and teaching and preaching. Those are the tools Jesus gave us. And, I think it works just fine. I don't think I need the police to be helping me.
In the words of
And I think
Jesus,
it's kind
Peter,
of
put away your sword.
correct. I think if I might put it this way, it's kind of sacrilegious to me to say something like, well, the church will be broken unless the government is helping it achieve its mission. I think, no, it's good for us to support the church. That's where that might come in. But it's not that the church will fail if
Right.
the state isn't helping it. So I think it's up to us to think the right way here, which is our mission is to convert people through preaching, through conversion, through sympathetic force of our influence on those around us, to baptize our kids and train them well. That's where we can make a great difference in the world.
Perfect. Father Rooney, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate your perspectives. Keep pumping out the massive flow of incredible work. And
Thank you,
I'll
Jake.
try to keep up on what on earth you're doing.
Yeah, well, you're always welcome to come to Hong Kong. Say hi.
Hey, next time I'm in Hong Kong, I'll pay you a visit for sure. Not sure when that will be. All right. Well, thanks again. All right. That's a podcast right there.
Okay.
Wow. We're
Well, thank you,
bumping
Jake.
closer to 9 o'clock than I thought. That was fun, though.